One shortened word. That is all it took. On a hot afternoon in August of 1941, a German soldier nobody has ever identified sat down at a machine that Adolf Hitler's high command believed could not be broken by anyone on Earth. And because he was tired, because he wanted to be finished and go home, he shortened one word. He never knew what he had done. He never will. His name is not in any archive on this planet. But 3 years later, when American boys were coming off the landing craft at Omaha Beach, the German armored reserves that should have driven them back into the sea were sitting 150 miles away in the wrong place, waiting for an invasion that was never coming. And the chain that leads back from that fact, a chain no one in Germany ever detected, runs through a hut in the English countryside, through a gardener's son with a pencil, and ends in a hot room in Athens with one exhausted man taking a shortcut. Britain never captured that machine, never saw one, never photographed one. Not once in 5.5 years of war. They broke it anyway. August the 30th, 1941, Athens. The heat in the city has not broken since morning. Along Vasilissus Sophias Avenue, the German staff limp in the still air. 4 months earlier, on the 27th of April, the swastika was raised over the Acropolis. Greece is occupied now. Crete has fallen. The Balkans belong to Berlin, and the men who administer that ownership sit in requisitioned buildings with the shutters closed against the light. In one of those buildings there is a room that outsiders do not enter. Inside it stands a machine. It looks like a typewriter that has been fed too much. A teleprinter, standard issue, the kind that clatters out battle orders in 100 headquarters across Europe. But bolted alongside it is something else. A gray steel box, roughly the size of a suitcase set on end. And inside that box, 12 wheels. Toothed wheels, each ringed with small levers that can be pushed left or right. 501 levers in total. The Germans call the box the Schlüsselsatz, the Cipher attachment, model SZ40, manufactured by C. Lorenz AG of Berlin. The men who use it have been told and believe that what it produces cannot be read by anyone on Earth. At the keyboard sits an operator. We do not know his name. We will never know his name. No archive holds it, no memoir recovers it, no monument records it. He is a German soldier, almost certainly a non-commissioned officer, almost certainly young, and by the middle of this afternoon, he has been working for hours. The message he has been ordered to send is long, around 4,000 characters. In the plodding arithmetic of teleprinter transmission, that is a very long time sitting in a hot room, hitting keys, watching the tape spool out, knowing that a single mistake anywhere in that river of letters could corrupt everything downstream. He finishes. The message goes out over the wireless link, north and west, over the mountains, over the Danube plain, to a receiving station roughly 800 miles away in Vienna. And then Vienna answers, not in cipher, in plain German, tapped out for anyone to hear. Didn't receive it, send it again. Put yourself in that room. The shutters, the heat, 4,000 characters already burned. The knowledge that doing it properly means walking to the machine, resetting 12 wheels to a new configuration, transmitting a new indicator, and then typing the entire message again from the beginning. He decides not to do that. He turns the wheels back to exactly where they started, the same 12 positions, the same starting point. And he sends the identical indicator he sent the first time, so that Vienna knows how to set up too. Then he begins to type. And now the small thing, the thing everything turns on. Here is the small human hinge on which this entire story turns. And it is not the decision to reuse the key. That was bad enough. It was forbidden by his own regulations for reasons his own cryptographers understood perfectly. It is what he does next. He is tired. He has typed this message once already. And so, as he works through it a second time, he starts to shorten things. Where the first version spelled out a word in full, the second version clips it. The German word for message number, Spruchnummer, becomes Spruchner. A phrase here contracts. A word there is dropped. Nothing dramatic, nothing that changes the meaning. The kind of small economizing that any exhausted person does at the end of a long shift. 2 messages, nearly the same, not quite the same, encrypted with exactly the same key. If he had retyped it perfectly, character for character, the 2 transmissions would have come out identical, and identical is useless. It reveals nothing. It is just the same locked door photographed twice. But because the second version drifts out of step with the first because a word contracted here and a phrase shortened there, the 2 encrypted streams begin to slide against each other. And in that sliding, in that tiny misalignment produced by nothing more than fatigue, the mathematics of the machine becomes visible. The operator does not know this. He will never know it. He finishes his second transmission, and somewhere around 800 miles away in Vienna, a colleague receives it cleanly, and the day ends and the war goes on. But there were other listeners. To understand who they were and why they had been waiting for this exact accident for over a year, we have to go backwards. Not far, just to 1940. 50 miles northwest of London, in the county of Buckinghamshire, there is a Victorian mansion of no particular architectural distinction. It was built by a stockbroker with more money than restraint, and it shows mock Tudor timbering set against red brick, a copper dome that has gone green, a jumble of styles arguing with each other across one facade. The estate is called Bletchley Park. It's where the line from Oxford to Cambridge crosses the main route north out of Euston. The Government Code and Cipher School moved here in August 1939, days before the war began. Officially, the staff were the captain's shooting party. Unofficially, and increasingly, the lawns behind the house were filling with prefabricated wooden huts. By 1940, Bletchley Park had achieved something that ought to have been impossible. They were reading Enigma. The story of how is a story of its own, and it does not begin in England. It begins in Poland. In December of 1932, a 27-year-old mathematician named Marian Rejewski, working for the Polish Cipher Bureau, reconstructed the internal wiring of the German Enigma machine using permutation theory and material supplied by French intelligence from an agent inside the German Cipher office. Rejewski and his colleagues Jerzy Rozycki and Henryk Zygalski built machines to attack it. They read German traffic through the 1930s while the rest of Europe assumed it could not be done. Then, on the 25th and 26th of July 1939, in the Kabati Woods at Pyry outside Warsaw, the Poles brought British and French officers into a bunker and showed them everything. Their reconstructed machines, their methods, their sheets. They gave it all away 5 weeks before the invasion because they knew what was coming and they knew they could not hold it alone. Alan Turing arrived at Bletchley Park on the 4th of September 1939, the day after Britain declared war. By March of 1940, the first Bombay was running. By August, Gordon Welchman's diagonal board had transformed it from promising to devastating. And so by the middle of 1940, in the wooden huts behind that ugly mansion, British codebreakers were reading the daily traffic of the German armed forces. Not all of it, not always quickly, but enough that convoy routes were being redrawn, enough that Fighter Command knew things it should not have known, enough that a new word entered the vocabulary of a very small number of people in London. Ultra, which is when the silence started. It was not announced. Nobody at Bletchley woke up one morning to a memorandum saying that the enemy had changed. It happened the way most intelligence failures happen, which is gradually in the form of an absence. The analysts noticed that certain kinds of message had stopped arriving. Not the tactical traffic, that was still flowing. A supply officer requisitioning fuel. A Luftwaffe squadron reporting serviceability. A U-boat acknowledging a position. Enigma was a field cipher, a machine issued in the tens of thousands, carried in trucks and submarines and forward command posts, and it carried the ordinary bloodstream of the German war. What had gone quiet was the brain. The traffic between the very highest levels, between the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht in Berlin and the headquarters of army groups in the field, between the men who moved 500,000 soldiers with a sentence that traffic had thinned and then vanished from Enigma altogether. It had not stopped existing. The signals were still in the air. Britain's interception network, the WWII service, could hear them. It simply could not recognize them because they did not sound like Morse. For anyone raised on wireless interception, Morse is a language of the ear. Dots and dashes, a human hand behind them, a rhythm as individual as handwriting. Skilled British operators could identify particular German operators by touch alone, could follow a specific man as he moved from one front to another, could hear him get tired. What began appearing on the dials was not that. It was a warble, a continuous mechanical inhuman stream. No gaps for a hand to breathe in. No rhythm to learn. Just a fast twittering noise pouring out of the receiver at a speed no human wrist could produce, and stopping as abruptly as it started. At the Metropolitan Police wireless station at Denmark Hill in South London, an experienced operator named Harold Kenworthy had been logging these transmissions and had no idea what they were. Nobody did. They were filed under a description rather than a name because there was no name yet, non-Morse. The two words are almost comically inadequate for what they were about to represent. They are the sound of an intelligence service admitting it does not know what it is looking at. The material eventually reached the desk of the one man in Britain most likely to make sense of it. John Hessel Tiltman was 46 years old in 1940, turning 47 the following May. He was a lieutenant colonel, tall, upright, with a clipped gray mustache and a habit of wearing tartan trousers with his uniform jacket, an eccentricity nobody senior enough to stop him ever bothered to stop. His story is not the story of the men around him. Tiltman had no university degree. He had been offered a place at Oxford at the age of 13, a genuinely extraordinary thing, and it had come to nothing, and instead of Oxford, he got the First World War. He served with the King's Own Scottish Borderers on the Western Front. He was wounded in 1917. He was awarded the Military Cross. He came back to a country that had used him up and had no obvious plan for him. And in 1920, he took a posting to a small, obscure organization in London that had just been created to read other people's mail. He never left. He spent the next 20 years becoming, without any formal training in mathematics whatsoever, the finest practical codebreaker in the British Empire. He broke Soviet diplomatic systems in the 1920s. He worked on Japanese naval and military ciphers in the 30s. He had a reputation among his colleagues that was almost superstitious. Give Tiltman a pile of intercepts and enough time, and something would come out of it. He was also, by the accounts of everyone who worked with him, relentlessly, unfashionably decent. He turned down promotion more than once because promotion meant administration, and administration meant not doing the work. He taught. He gave credit away. When Americans arrived later in the war, suspicious and awkward and expecting condescension, it was Tiltman who disarmed them. He looked at the non-Morse intercepts and began to reason. The speed alone told him something. This was not a hand-sent cipher. Whatever produced this was mechanical, and it was fast, and the fact that it was fast meant it was almost certainly a teleprinter system. Teleprinters do not use Morse. They use a 5-bit code known as International Telegraph Alphabet Number 2, descended from the work of Emile Bodo and refined by Donald Murray, in which every character is represented by a pattern of 5 elements, each of which is either a mark or a space. On or off, 1 or 0. 32 possible combinations, enough for the alphabet plus control characters like carriage return and line feed. And that gave Tiltman a hypothesis about how the enemy might be encrypting it, because the theory already existed and had existed for over 20 years. In 1918, an American engineer at AT&T named Gilbert Vernam had proposed something elegant. If your text is already a stream of ones and zeros, then you can encipher it by generating a second stream of ones and zeros a key and combining the two bit by bit using a simple rule. If the 2 bits are the same, output 0. If they differ, output 1 exclusive, or the most basic logical operation there is. Its beauty is that it undoes itself. Apply the same key stream to the ciphertext and the plaintext falls out again. Nobody needs to invert anything. The machine at the receiving end runs the identical process as the machine at the sending end. And if the key stream is truly random and used only once, the result is not merely difficult to break. It is mathematically impossible to break. It is the one perfect cipher. But a truly random key has to be physically distributed. Reels of tape carried by courier to every station. In 1918, for a handful of diplomatic circuits, that was manageable. For a continental war fought at the speed of the Wehrmacht, it was not. So the Germans did what every engineer does when the perfect solution is impractical. They approximated it. They built a machine that would generate a key stream that looked random. That machine was what Tiltman was hearing. He now knew, or strongly suspected, what kind of thing he was fighting. He did not know anything else. He did not know how many wheels it had. He did not know how they moved. He did not know their sizes, their wiring, their interaction. And this is the first thing that has to be understood clearly, because almost every popular account of Bletchley Park gets it backwards. Enigma was not Hitler's cipher. Enigma was the workhorse. Tens of thousands of units, spread across every arm of the German military, used by ordinary signalers under battlefield pressure, and precisely because it was so widely distributed, it was vulnerable. Machines could be captured, operators could be sloppy, procedures could be inferred. Britain had the Polish inheritance, had a physical understanding of the device, had the bombas. What Tiltman was now staring at was something else entirely. This was a strategic system, not carried in submarines or forward posts, but installed in fixed, heavily guarded locations, linked by dedicated radio circuits between the highest headquarters of the Reich. Berlin to Army Group South. Berlin to the Balkans. Berlin to North Africa low, because there are not many people in an army who are authorized to move an army. The value is almost unimaginable. An Enigma decrypt might tell you where a division was on Tuesday. A decrypt from this system might tell you what the German High Command intended to do with 12 divisions over the next 3 months, in Hitler's own strategic vocabulary, signed by the men who would execute it. Bletchley Park gave the whole family of new teleprinter ciphers a code name, Fish. Individual systems within the family got their own names as they were identified. The Siemens T52 became Sturgeon, and the Lorenz SZ40, when they eventually understood it was distinct, became Tunny. They had a name for it. They had a theory of how it worked in principle. They had never seen one. This is the second thing that has to be understood, and it is the fact that makes everything that follows almost hard to believe. From 1940 until the closing days of the war, no British codebreaker laid eyes on a Lorenz cipher attachment. Not a captured example, not a photograph, not a manual, not a defector's sketch, nothing. They had one thing only. They had the noise it made. Everything Britain would ever learn about the internal architecture of that machine, the number of its wheels, the size of each wheel, the way the wheels stepped, the logic that combined them would have to be deduced from the encrypted output alone. From patterns in a stream of characters that were designed specifically and expensively to have no patterns at all. It is roughly the position of an astronomer asked to describe the gears inside a clock on the far side of the moon, using nothing but the sound of its ticking. And the clock, we now know, looked like this. 12 wheels in a row inside that gray box. They fell into 3 groups. 5 of them the British would eventually call the chi wheels, after the Greek letter. 5 more they would call the psi wheels. And 2 more would be the motor wheels. Their exact sizes, and the reason those sizes were chosen, would not be known in Britain for another 5 months. And the way they were finally worked out is the reason this story is worth telling. And 2 more, the motor wheels, 61 and 37. Each position on each wheel carried a small lever, a cam, which could be set to one of 2 states. 501 cams in total, and each of them was a binary decision, which meant the pattern of pins alone offered a number of possibilities, so large it has no useful comparison. The principle was this. Each character typed on the keyboard was a 5-bit pattern. The chi wheels contributed 5 bits. The psi wheels contributed 5 bits. Both were added to the character exclusive OR, and the result went out on the air. The chi wheels stepped 1 position for every single character. Regular. Predictable if you knew where they started. The psi wheels did not. Sometimes they moved. Sometimes they stayed exactly where they were, and repeated their previous contribution. And what decided whether they moved was the 2 motor wheels, one of them driving the other, producing an irregular stutter that had no relationship at all to the text being sent. That irregularity was the heart of the design, and it was vicious. It meant that even if you somehow worked out the chi contribution, the psi layer underneath it would not step in any rhythm you could anticipate. It meant the key stream never settled into a pattern. It meant the key stream would run for an astronomical span before it ever came back around to where it began a cycle so long that the German engineers who designed it regarded it, for every practical purpose, as infinite. German cryptographic authorities assessed the system and concluded it was secure. They were not being arrogant. Given what they knew about the state of the art in 1940, given that no adversary possessed the machine, given the size of the key space, the assessment was reasonable. It was also wrong, and it was wrong for a reason no engineer can design away. The machine was perfect. The machine was operated by people. Through the first half of 1941, the Germans were still learning to use it. The Army ran the SZ40 experimentally before committing to it, and one of the links they used to shake it down ran between Vienna and Athens, a circuit that had suddenly become important. Because in April, the Wehrmacht had swept through Yugoslavia and Greece, and the Balkans now needed to be governed and supplied from the center. On the 22nd of June 1941, 3 million men crossed the Soviet frontier. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in the history of warfare. And the strategic conversation that was about to run between Hitler's headquarters and the army groups, grinding east through Russia, the conversation about reserves, about objective, about what the German high command actually believed and feared that conversation was going to be carried, increasingly on fish. Britain could hear it. Britain could record it. Britain could not read one character of it. There is a particular kind of helplessness in that, and the people at Bletchley Park felt it. They had cracked the field cipher of the German armed forces. They were reading the enemy's nervous system while remaining totally blind to his mind. And every day the intercept logs from the non-Morse stations grew thicker with material that might as well have been static. The organization adapted the way organizations do. A small unit called the research section, based in one of the huts, was given the problem, the pile of things nobody else had cracked. And into that section in 1941 came a young man who did not fit the profile of anyone else in the building. William Thomas Tutte was 24 years old. He had been born on the 14th of May, 1917, in Newmarket, Suffolk. His father was a gardener. His mother was a housekeeper. The family lived on the estates where they worked, and Bill Tutte's early education happened because a grammar school place existed and because he was quietly, obviously, unmistakably clever in a way that could not be ignored, even in a country that was still very good at ignoring that in the children of gardeners. He got to Trinity College, Cambridge, to read natural sciences, chemistry. He was, by every account, painfully shy. He did not perform. He did not hold a room. He was the sort of man who could sit through an entire dinner and say 11 words, and the words would be worth hearing, and nobody would remember he had spoken. What he did do alongside chemistry was mathematics, not officially, but in the company of 3 friends at Trinity with whom he worked on problems in graph theory and combinatorics, publishing under a collective pseudonym. The mathematics was the real thing. The chemistry was the enrollment. In the spring of 1941, he was recommended to the government code and cipher school through his Trinity connections. He arrived at Bletchley Park in June, and for months afterwards he was, in his own later description, not much use to anybody. Popular retellings like to say he was hired because he was good at crossword puzzles. That is a tidy story about somebody else. Tutte came through the university pipeline on the recommendation of dons who had watched him think. For a while, nobody quite knew what to do with him. He was put on Italian ciphers. He was put on this and that. He was shy, he was slow to speak, and slowness was not fashionable in a building where the culture prized the fast answer. In the summer of 1941, he was moved into the research section, which was, in the honest accounting of the place, where you put a person you suspected was valuable while you waited to find out how. Around him, the park was becoming something enormous. The huts were multiplying across the lawn. Wrens and civilians and mathematicians and chess champions and crossword setters and linguists were arriving by the trainload into a village that had no idea what was happening at the end of its high street. On the 21st of October 1941, Turing, Welchman, Hugh Alexander, and Stuart Milner Barry would write directly to Churchill, over the heads of their own management, to say that the work was being strangled by a lack of clerical staff. Churchill's response was a minute with 4 words at the top: action this day. That was the machine Tutte had joined. Ferociously alive, badly stretched, working around the clock, and through the last days of August 1941 in a room in Athens, a man nobody would ever identify made the small decision that would hand all of it the door. His 2 transmissions went out on the 30th of August. Both were logged by British interception. Both carried in the clear, at the head of the message, the 12-letter indicator that told the receiving station how to set its wheels. The same 12 letters. Twice. That indicator was not a secret code, it was a housekeeping convention. Under the procedure in force at the time, the sender chose the starting positions of the 12 wheels and communicated them to the receiver as 12 letters, drawn from an agreed list, sent in plain language before the ciphered text began. There was no security in it, because there was not supposed to need to be. The security lived in the machine, and in the absolute rule that you never ever use the same setting twice. So when the 2 intercepts reached the analysts, the anomaly was not buried. It was the first thing on the page. 2 messages, roughly 4,000 characters each, same source, same destination, same day, same indicator. In the language of cryptanalysis, that is called a depth. It is the single most valuable thing an adversary can hand you, and every cipher clerk in every army on earth is trained from the first week to avoid producing one, because the mathematics of what happens next is not subtle. If 2 different messages are enciphered with the identical key stream, and you add the 2 ciphertexts together using that same exclusive or rule, the key stream cancels. It disappears completely. What you are left with is the 2 plain texts added to each other, 2 ordinary German military messages, tangled together with the unbreakable machine removed from the problem entirely. That is not a solved puzzle. It is a hard puzzle. But it is a hard puzzle in a language you speak, about a subject you understand, instead of an impossible puzzle in a mathematics you have never seen. There was only one condition. It only works if the 2 messages are not identical. If the operator in Athens had retyped his 4,000 characters with mechanical accuracy, the 2 ciphertexts would have matched exactly. The addition would have produced nothing but zeros, and the whole opportunity would have evaporated into a curiosity noted in a logbook and forgotten. He didn't. He abbreviated. Somewhere in the second transmission, near the beginning, a word that had been spelled out in full the first time came out shortened. And from that character onward, the 2 messages were out of alignment, carrying the same meaning, in different lengths, at different positions against the same key. That is the whole hinge. Not laziness exactly, not treachery. Just the entirely human instinct, at the end of a long, hot afternoon, to write Spruckner instead of Sprucknummer. 800 miles away, in a hut, the intercepts landed on the desk of the lieutenant colonel in tartan trousers. There is a version of this story in which Tiltman found those messages months later in a discard pile, guided there by a lover's complaint that he had stopped noticing things. It is a good story. It is not true. There is no girlfriend in the archives, no rejected file, no October discovery. The intercepts went to the man whose job it was to look at exactly this, and he looked at them within days, and he understood immediately what he was holding. What he did next took roughly 10 days. He worked the way he had always worked. Guess a word. German military messages begin in predictable ways. Assume a probable opening at a probable position in the first message. Add it in. See what that forces the second message to say at the same position. Read the result. If it is German, keep going. If it is nonsense, throw it away and guess again. 10 days of that. 10 days of hypothesis and collapse and hypothesis again. Over 4,000 characters. With no machine, no assistance beyond paper, pencil, and a mind that had been doing this since 1920. At the end of it, he had both messages. He had read a German high command signal from Athens to Vienna, and the men who sent it went on sending year after year, never understanding what had been taken from them. But the messages were not the prize. The messages were routine. What mattered was that once you know the plain text and you know the cipher text, you can subtract one from the other and recover the thing in between. The key stream. 4,000 characters of pure output from a machine that no allied person had ever seen. Not the message it carried. The machine's own voice, isolated, stripped of everything else, laid out in a continuous unbroken sequence. Tiltman had not broken the Lorenz cipher. He would have been the first to say so. He had broken 2 messages, through an enemy error that might never repeat. What he had produced was a specimen. And in October of 1941, that specimen, 4,000 characters of apparently structureless noise, generated by 12 wheels of unknown size turning in an unknown pattern inside a box in a country nobody could reach, was handed to the research section. It was given to the shy 24-year-old son of a gardener who had not yet contributed anything of note to the war, with an instruction that amounted to a shrug. See if there's anything in it. What Bill Tutte did with that piece of paper over the following months would become, in the judgment of historians who came much later and knew the whole story, one of the greatest single intellectual achievements of the entire war. He was going to take a stream of numbers and from the numbers alone reconstruct a machine he could not see, in a country he could not enter, wheel by wheel, down to the last of its 501 pins. And he was going to start by noticing something about the number 41, October 1941. Hut 8 is full. Hut 6 is full. The lawns behind the mansion have disappeared under wooden buildings that went up faster than anyone bothered to paint them. And inside those buildings, the light is bad and the heat is worse, and the noise never stops. The research section is where the leftovers go. Not the failures. The problems that nobody has yet worked out how to fail at properly. The ciphers with no visible way in, the systems with no captured hardware, the piles of intercepted noise that have defeated everyone who has looked at them so far. If a problem had an obvious method, it went to a hut with a number on the door and a shift rota and 40 people. If it did not, it came here. A young man sits at a desk with a sheet of paper in front of him. 4,000 characters. Handwritten out in the 5-letter teleprinter alphabet, in columns. It is the recovered key stream from the Athens intercepts, the raw output of a machine sitting in occupied Greece, isolated from the messages it had been hiding. Bill Tutte is 24 years old. He has been at Bletchley Park for months and has produced nothing anybody would put in a report. He is so quiet that colleagues who worked in the same room for weeks would later say they barely knew him. He does not argue, he does not volunteer, he does not perform intelligence, which in that building, among that particular collection of very fast, very confident young men, meant he was easy to overlook. He is handed the paper with something close to a shrug. See what you can find. And then he does a thing that is almost impossible to make cinematic, and which is, nonetheless, the reason this story exists. He stares at it, not for an hour, not for a day, for weeks. He would later describe his method, in his own dry understatement, as writing the characters out on squared paper in various widths and looking for repeats. That is genuinely what it was. He took his 4,000 characters and wrote them across the page in rows of a fixed length, say 25 per row, so that the text formed a rectangle. Then he looked down the columns. If the machine's output happened to repeat every 25 characters, the columns would show it. Identical symbols would line up vertically like a watermark rising out of the noise. Then he did it again, with a different width. Then again. There is a specific kind of courage in this that has nothing to do with battlefields, and men who have worked long jobs recognize it immediately. It is the courage of doing something tedious alone, without visible progress, past the point where anybody sensible would have stopped, on nothing but a suspicion that there is something there. Every morning he sat down and rewrote a wall of letters into a different shape. Every evening the columns showed nothing, and the next morning he did it again. The research section had one thing going for it, and it was that Tiltman ran the kind of shop where a young man could disappear into a problem for a month without being asked to justify himself. In most organizations on Earth, in wartime, that does not happen. Somebody notices the unproductive junior and moves him somewhere he can be useful. Nobody moved Bill Tutte. And then at the end of one of those days, he wrote the stream out at a width of 41. And the column spoke, not clearly, not everywhere. But the repeats were there significantly more coincidences down the columns than random chance had any business producing. A faint statistical shadow of a pattern, appearing every 41 characters in a stream that had been designed to have no period at all. 41, that number meant something concrete. It meant that somewhere inside that gray box in Athens there was a component with 41 positions, turning steadily one step per character, coming back around to where it started every 41st letter, and leaving the faintest fingerprint each time it did. He had just measured a wheel he had never seen. Understand what has happened here. Britain has no machine. No photograph. It has a sheet of paper, and a 24-year-old chemistry graduate has just established from that sheet fact about the interior of a device sitting in a guarded building in occupied Greece. That single number was the crack in the wall, because once you have one wheel, you can subtract its effect and look at what remains. Tutte took his stream, removed the contribution of the 41 position wheel, and looked at the residue. Then he ran the same test again on what was left. 31, then 29, then 26, then 23. 5 wheels, all of them stepping regularly, 1 position per character. Their sizes chosen so that no two shared a common factor. He labeled them with the Greek letter chi, and the name stuck for the rest of the war and for all of history afterwards. But when he pulled all 5 chi wheels out of the stream, what remained was not clean. It was another layer, and this one behaved differently. Sometimes it changed. Sometimes it repeated itself, sat still, and did nothing at all, and it did that on no schedule he could find. 5 more wheels. 43, 47, 51, 53, 59 positions. He called them psi, and governing whether the psi wheels moved or froze, 2 more wheels, 61 and 37, one driving the other. 12 wheels, their exact sizes, their arrangement, the logic that combined them, the irregular stutter at the heart of the design that the German engineers had built in specifically to defeat exactly this kind of analysis. By January of 1942, working with the research section with Tiltman, with a mathematician named Jerry Morgan, with colleagues who tested and extended his findings, because this was never one man alone in a room, and Tutte himself never claimed otherwise, the complete logical structure of the Lorenz SZ40 had been reconstructed on paper in Buckinghamshire. A machine no allied human being had ever seen. There is a story that gets told about the Second World War, and it is mostly a story about men with rifles and men with maps. That story is true, and it is not enough. Because somewhere in the middle of it, in a badly heated hut 50 miles from London, a gardener's son with a pencil built a working blueprint of Hitler's most secret machine out of nothing but 4,000 characters of static and the refusal to stop looking. No one in Berlin ever grasped the scale of what had just been done to them. Now, here is where a lesser story would declare victory and roll credits. Knowing how a machine works is not the same as reading its messages. Think of it this way. Tutte had produced the engineering diagram of a safe. He knew the number of dials, the size of each dial, the mechanism that linked them. What he did not know for any given message was the combination. Every transmission started with the 12 wheels set to a fresh position, and the pin patterns on those wheels were themselves changed periodically by the Germans. To read a message, you needed 2 things. You needed the pin patterns, which of the 501 cams were up and which were down. And you needed the starting position of all 12 wheels for that specific message. Through the first half of 1942, that gap was filled by hand, slowly, message by message, and the output was thin. Getting the pin patterns reliably took a second breakthrough, and it came from a name that everyone knows. Alan Turing had been at Bletchley since the first week of the war. He had built the Bombay. He had broken naval enigma. By 1942, he was the closest thing the park had to a resident oracle, and in July of that year he was brought onto the Tunny problem. What Turing produced was a hand method for deriving the wheel pin patterns from a long stretch of key that had already been recovered. It was intricate, it was iterative. It involved making a guess about a few pins and following the consequences outward until the whole pattern either resolved or collapsed. His colleagues named it after him, in the affectionate and slightly mocking way of that place. Turingjury, it was slow. So by the second half of 1942, a chain existed. Get a depth, break it by hand. Recover a stretch of key, feed that key into Turingjury. Recover the month's pin patterns. Then, with the patterns known, break individual messages by finding the starting positions. A specialist section was formed in October 1942 to do exactly this work by hand. It was housed in the mansion at first, and it was named, in the Bletchley habit of naming things, after whoever ran them, after its head, Major Ralph Tester, 40 years old. A man who had spent years working as an accountant in Germany before the war, and whose German was consequently native grade. The testery. They read Tunny, actually read it. Strategic traffic between the German High Command and Army Group headquarters, decrypted by men with pencils in a British country house. And for a few months in 1942 it worked. Then the Germans changed the procedure, and everything Britain had built came apart. The 1st of October 1942. There was nothing hostile about it. No German cryptographer had detected a leak. Nobody in Berlin suspected that a 25-year-old in Buckinghamshire had drawn their machine from memory it never had. This was routine security housekeeping of exactly the kind any competent signals organization performs. They abolished the 12-letter indicator. Under the old system, the sender chose the wheel's starting positions and sent them in clear at the head of the message. That was the convention that had allowed a British analyst to look at 2 intercepts from Athens and see instantly that they carried the same setting. It was the reason the depth of the 30th of August was visible at all. In its place came the QEP book. Each station received a book of numbered settings. To start a message, the sender transmitted a serial number QEP 47, and both ends looked up entry 47 in their identical books and set their wheels accordingly. The actual positions never traveled over the air. There was nothing in the transmission to compare. Depths did not become harder to find. They became invisible. The effect at Bletchley was immediate and severe. The entire method of attack that Tutte's breakthrough had made possible depended on the existence of readable depths as the entry point. Take away the ability to spot 2 messages sharing a key, and you take away the raw material that fed Turingjury, which fed the pin patterns, which fed the testery. Britain had solved the machine, and the enemy, without knowing it, had just changed the lock. This is the part of the story that does not appear in the shorter versions, and it is the part that anyone who has worked a long career recognizes in their bones. The victory that turns out to be temporary, the solution that arrives just in time to be obsoleted. You do the impossible thing and the world does not stop and applaud. The world simply moves and you have to do the impossible thing again. And the timing could not have been worse. By the winter of 1942 into 43, the Fish network was expanding fast. New links were coming on air across occupied Europe. Britain's interception stations, Knockholt in Kent, had been built specifically for this traffic. Staffed by operators trained to catch the warble, were pulling in more Tunny than ever. More traffic than ever, and less of it readable than the year before. What broke the deadlock came fast, and it came within weeks of the lock being changed. It was not a flash of insight from a single mind. It was a change in what kind of problem they decided to solve. In November of 1942, barely a month after the QEP books came in, Tutte went back to the mathematics one more time and found something different. Not a way to spot depths because there were no more depths. A way to attack a single isolated message on its own, using nothing but statistics. The reasoning went like this. German plaintext is not random. Certain characters recur far more than others. The teleprinter alphabet includes control characters, the shift codes, the letter and figure shifts that appear constantly. And crucially, the psi wheels stand still much of the time, which means the psi layer contains long runs of repetition. All of which meant that if you took the ciphertext and combined it with a guessed chi wheel pattern, and you had guessed the starting position correctly, the result would show a very slight statistical bias away from randomness. Not a readable message, just a lean, a number a little higher than it ought to be. Tutte's method, it became known as the double delta, or the 1+2 break-in, could find the starting positions of the first two chi wheels of a message from the ciphertext alone. There was one difficulty. To find the correct position, you had to try every possible combination of positions for those two wheels. 41 multiplied by 31, 1,271 settings, and for each of those settings you had to run a statistical count across the entire length of the message, thousands of characters, and record the score. Millions of individual character comparisons per message to test one hypothesis about two wheels. A room full of people with pencils could not do it. Not in a week, not in a month, and certainly not fast enough for the answer to still be worth anything by the time it arrived. Intelligence has a shelf life. A German strategic directive read 6 weeks late is history, not intelligence. The mathematics was right, and the mathematics was useless because no human hand could execute it. Which is when Max Newman walked into the problem. Newman was 45. A professor of mathematics at St. John's College, Cambridge, born in London in 1897 to a German Jewish father who had come to England from Bromberg and who, in the anti-German climate of the First World War, had changed the family name from Neumann to Newman. In 1940, Newman's father had been interned as an enemy alien. Newman himself had considered sending his family to America. He knew precisely what the war was about. He was also, and this matters, the man who in 1935 had given the lecture course at Cambridge that sent a young Alan Turing off to write the paper that invented the concept of the computer. Newman arrived at Bletchley in August 1942. He was put into the testery doing hand cryptanalysis, and he was, by his own admission and everybody else's, not very good at it. He found it frustrating. He was not a puzzle solver by temperament. He was an abstract mathematician, and what he saw when he looked at Tutte's statistical method was not a puzzle at all. It was an algorithm, the same operation, repeated without variation, an enormous number of times, with a counter running. Newman went to the head of the park with a proposal that was, for late 1942, close to heretical. Stop trying to do this with people. Build a machine that does it. He was given the authority to try, and in December of 1942, a new section was created. Bletchley named it, as always, after the man in charge, the Newmanry. He got a handful of mathematicians, Jack Good, a statistician of 26 who had been Turing's assistant and who understood Bayesian reasoning better than almost anyone alive. Donald Michie, who was 19 years old, and an engineering commission handed to the post office research station and to a firm in Letchworth. The machine they built was called the Heath Robinson. The name was a joke, and it was affectionate, and it was also, in the end, a diagnosis. William Heath Robinson was a British cartoonist famous for drawing absurdly elaborate contraptions held together with string and improbable pulleys, performing simple tasks by ludicrous means. Every man in Britain knew the reference the way an American would know a Rube Goldberg machine. The Robinson ran 2 loops of paper tape simultaneously. One carried the intercepted ciphertext, the other carried the generated keywheel pattern. The tapes ran over pulleys past photoelectric readers at 1,000 characters per second, and electronic counting circuits tallied the matches. It worked. In June of 1943, it went into operation at Bletchley Park, and it produced real results, and it broke real messages. And it was, in daily practice, a nightmare. The 2 tapes had to stay in perfect synchronization, character for character, for the entire length of the run. They were paper. They were spinning at high speed over sprockets and pulleys. Paper stretches, paper slips. And the moment one tape gained a single character on the other, every count the machine produced was meaningless, and the operators could not always tell that it had happened. The tapes tore. They snapped and whipped around the room. Sometimes friction heated them enough that they smoldered, and the smell of scorched paper filled the hut. Wrens spent enormous portions of their shifts repairing tape, re-splicing loops, and rerunning jobs that had silently corrupted themselves. This next point gets left out of almost every telling, and it is the reason the Heath Robinson has to be in this story rather than skipped over. Colossus did not appear because somebody had a vision. Colossus appeared because the Heath Robinson failed in a specific diagnosable way, and one engineer looked at that specific failure and understood exactly what it meant. That engineer was Thomas Harold Flowers. Tommy Flowers was 37 years old in 1943. He had been born on the 22nd of December, 1905 in Poplar, in the East End of London. His father was a bricklayer. There is no version of Flowers' early life that includes Cambridge. What it included was an apprenticeship in mechanical engineering at the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich and night classes at the University of London for a degree in electrical engineering, taken in the evenings after full working days, because that was the only route available to a bricklayer's son who happened to be brilliant. He joined the post office in 1926 and went to the research station at Dollis Hill in northwest London. And there, through the 1930s, he worked on the automatic telephone exchange, the machinery that connected calls without an operator, which is where he learned the thing that nobody else in Britain believed. Conventional wisdom on thermionic valves, vacuum tubes, in American was absolute, and it was shared by essentially every qualified engineer in the country. Valves were unreliable. They burned out. They were fine in a wireless set with a dozen of them. But any machine using hundreds would spend more time broken than working, and a machine using thousands was a fantasy. Flowers knew this was wrong, and he knew it because he had done it. He had built experimental telephone equipment using between 3,000 and 4,000 valves and run it, and he had found the crucial fact. Valves overwhelmingly fail at the moment of switch on, when the cold filament takes the thermal shock of sudden current. A valve left running continuously, at a stable temperature, running well below its rated maximum, will run for a very long time indeed. The rule that followed was simple, and it was the entire secret. Never turn the machine off. Flowers had been at Bletchley before. He had been brought in early in the war to work on an attachment for the bomb, a project that came to nothing much. He knew the place, he knew Turing, and Turing was the one who had recommended him to Newman in the first place. When he was shown the Heath Robinson and its problems, Flowers did not propose to fix it. He proposed to eliminate the reason it kept failing. The synchronization problem existed because there were two tapes, so get rid of one of them. Do not store the chi wheel pattern on paper at all. Generate it electronically inside the machine, using valve circuits thyotron rings that could be set to reproduce any wheel pattern, and stepped in perfect lockstep with the single remaining tape as it fed through. One tape. Nothing to slip against. The machine would need something in the region of 1,500 valves. The reaction at Bletchley Park was not enthusiasm. It was polite disbelief. Newman's own view, and the view of the senior people who heard the proposal, was that a machine of that size could not be made reliable, and, more damningly, could not be built in time to matter. The war would not wait 18 months for an engineer's theory about filament temperature. There was pressure to order more Robinsons instead, on the sound managerial logic that a flawed machine that exists beats a perfect machine that does not. Flowers was told, in effect, no. And then Tommy Flowers went back to Dollis Hill and built it anyway. He had the backing of his own director at the post office, W.G. Radley, and he had a workforce of post office engineers, and he had a conviction that he was right, that no amount of senior skepticism was going to shift. He put his own money into the work. He drove his team through shifts that ran into the night in a research station in northwest London, while the men who had rejected the proposal waited for a machine they did not expect to arrive. It is worth pausing on what he was actually risking, because the popular telling makes it sound like romantic defiance, and it was not. Flowers had no independent wealth, he had a family. He was a post office engineer, a civil servant, staking his professional standing and his own money on a machine that the mathematicians of Bletchley Park, the most prestigious concentration of intellectual authority in wartime Britain, had assessed and found implausible. If he was wrong, he would be the man who wasted the post office's war on a fantasy. From the day he began to the day the machine worked was 10 months. Through the summer and autumn of 1943 in Dollis Hill, the thing came together. Racks of valves, photoelectric readers, a tape transport that had to pull paper past the reading head at 5,000 characters per second, nearly 30 miles per hour without tearing it, which required a sprocket-driven design of considerable delicacy because at that speed paper behaves less like paper and more like a blade. Counting circuits, switch panels, plug boards, so that the pattern being generated and the logical operation being performed could be reconfigured by hand between runs. By December 1943, the machine was working at Dollis Hill. In January 1944, it was dismantled onto lorries, 50 miles northwest, and reassembled in a hut at Bletchley Park. Stood 7 feet high, 16 feet across, it contained 1,600 valves. It filled a room with heat and with a soft, continuous glow, and the Lorenz who would come to operate it found that the warmth was the one genuine comfort in a British winter in an unheated wooden building. They called it Colossus. On the 5th of February 1944, it ran its first operational job at Bletchley Park. D-Day was 4 months away. And the fundamental question, whether the German High Command believed the invasion would come at Normandy or somewhere else entirely, was about to be answered by a machine that officially did not exist, invented by a bricklayer's son who had been told it could not be done. Running a method devised by a gardener's son who had spent weeks staring at a page of nonsense until the number 41 rose out of it. Neither of them would be allowed to say a word about it for 30 years. February the 5th, 1944. A hut at Bletchley Park. The machine fills the room the way a locomotive fills a shed. 7 feet of steel racking, 16 feet across, and inside it 1,600 glass valves burning quietly in the dark, each one a small orange filament, all of them together throwing off a heat you can feel from the doorway. The room smells of hot dust and warm paper and the faint sweetness of heated bakelite. Along one wall, a bank of switches. Along another, panels of neon lamps waiting to count. And at the front, a loop of paper tape, spliced end to end into a continuous ring, hanging on a wooden frame called the bedstead, threaded over pulleys. A young woman in the uniform of the Women's Royal Naval Service checks the splice, because a bad splice at this speed does not fail gently. Then the tape starts. 5,000 characters per second. The paper moves past the photoelectric reader at something close 30 miles an hour, a blur, with a hard, flat hiss, and the light shines through the punched holes, and the valves begin to count. Nobody in that room outside a very small circle knows what the machine is for. The Wrens who run it, and there will eventually be 272 of them working these machines in shifts around the clock, have been trained in procedure and nothing else. Load the tape. Set the switches according to the sheet. Start the run. Watch the counters. Write down the numbers. Report the result. Do not ask. Do not discuss it with the girl on the next shift. Most of them are between 18 and 22 years old. One of them, Dorothy Dubuisson, worked those machines and would say afterwards that they simply did what they were told, night after night, without being given the smallest idea of why it mattered. They were operating the world's first large-scale, programmable electronic digital computer. Nobody told them that either. What the machine is actually doing needs to be said precisely, because this is the single most commonly mangled fact in the entire story. Colossus does not decrypt anything. It never did. Not once, not one German message was ever read by a machine at Bletchley Park. What Colossus does is count. The tape carries the intercepted cipher text. Inside the machine, valve circuits generate the pattern of the chi wheels. The two are combined electronically, character by character, and the counters tally how often a particular condition occurs. Then the machine steps the wheel position by one, and does it again, and again, through every possible starting combination, 1,271 of them, for the first 2 wheels alone, and for each one it prints a score on a typewriter bolted to the side. Almost all the scores are what randomness would predict. One of them, if the operators are lucky and the message is long enough, is a little higher than it ought to be. Not dramatically. A bulge in the statistics. That is the answer, not the message, just the starting positions of the wheels. The Wren tears off the printout and takes it out of the room. And it goes down the path to another building, to the testery, where Major Ralph Tester's people are waiting. And there, men and women with pencils and paper and native German take those wheel positions and do the rest of the work by hand stripping off the chi layer, then wrestling the irregular psi layer out of what remains until German words come up out of the noise. A machine and a room full of people chained together, neither one able to do it alone. That is the honest picture of Bletchley Park, and it is better than the myth. There was no magic box. There was a division of labor between Silicon's ancestor and human patience, and it ran 24 hours a day. The first Colossus is fast, and it is not fast enough. Flowers already knows this. Before the first machine has even finished proving itself, he is designing the second, and the design is not a refinement, it is a reconception. Mark I tests one position of the tape at a time. Mark II will use shift registers to hold 5 consecutive positions in the circuits at once, and process all 5 in the same instant, the same tape, at the same speed, doing 5 times the work. 5 times the throughput from the same tape speed. 2,400 valves instead of 1,600. He is promised it will be needed by the 1st of June. Nobody tells him why. He does not ask, because at Bletchley Park you did not ask. But a man building a code-breaking machine in the spring of 1944 with a hard deadline in early June is capable of arithmetic. The post office engineers at Dollis Hill work through the spring in shifts that run past midnight, and on the 1st of June 1944, Colossus Mark II runs at Bletchley Park, 5 days before the invasion of Normandy. Now, This is the point in the story where the temptation to exaggerate becomes almost unbearable, and it must be resisted because the truth is remarkable enough and the lie is easy to catch. Colossus did not win D-Day. Nobody at Bletchley Park read an order from Hitler saying the invasion will be repelled at Normandy. That is not what happened, and anyone who tells you it is has not read the files. What happened is quieter, and in some ways more chilling. The Allies had spent the better part of a year constructing an enormous lie, Operation Fortitude. A fictional army group in southeast England, the 1st United States Army Group, commanded on paper by George Patton, complete with inflatable tanks in Kentish fields, plywood landing craft in the estuaries, and a torrent of fake radio traffic between headquarters that did not exist. Its purpose was to persuade the German High Command that the real landing would come at the Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing, the obvious choice, the place any sensible planner would pick. Everything depended on the Germans believing it. And there was no way to know whether they did. You cannot ask. You cannot see inside another man's mind. You build the most elaborate deception in military history, and then you stand there in the last days of May with 5,000 ships loading and 150,000 men waiting, and you have absolutely no idea whether the enemy has swallowed it or is quietly laughing at you. Except that Britain could hear the German High Command talking to itself. That is what fish traffic was, not tactical chatter. Strategic conversation between Berlin and the army groups, assessments, appreciations, orders of battle. The German command's own honest internal picture of where the blow was going to fall and where the reserves should therefore stand. And what the decrypted traffic showed through the spring of 1944 was that the German High Command's assessment of Allied strength in Britain was inflated, that the Phantom Army Group was being tracked as real, and that the weight of German expectation remained fixed on the Pas de Calais. The deception was holding. There is no roar of triumph in that. There is only a planner in a corridor being handed a folder and reading a German general's private estimate of the Allied order of battle and seeing, in the enemy's own words, the shape of a lie the Allies had built. The Panzer Reserves stayed north of the Seine. They were still there, waiting for a landing that would never come, while men were dying on Omaha Beach. Colossus was part of the machinery that produced that confidence. Not the whole of it decrypted Enigma aerial reconnaissance. The double-cross agents run by MI5 all fed the same picture. But Fish was the channel that carried what the highest levels of the German command actually believed. And by June 1944, Britain was reading it. Eisenhower, in the last hours before the decision, was a man betting 150,000 lives on weather and on a lie. He was betting with a slightly better hand than he could ever explain to anyone. The machines multiplied. Colossus 3 in June, then a steady procession through the second half of 1944 and into 1945 until 10 of them stood at Bletchley Park, running around the clock, hot and glowing, tended by Lorenz on rotating shifts who still had not been told what they were doing. The 10th was commissioned in the final weeks of the war in Europe. Through the autumn of 1944 and the winter that followed, Fish decrypts tracked German dispositions across the continent with a precision that German commanders found inexplicable. Divisional locations, supply states, reserve movements, the retreat from France, the defense of the Rhine, the exhaustion at the center of a collapsing empire, all of it discussed by the German High Command over links that Britain was reading. And the last thing that has to be said about the intelligence, the thing that separates the honest account from the flattering one, is this. Knowing did not always mean acting. Ultra had a rule, and the rule was absolute. Nothing could be done with the intelligence that would reveal it existed. If a decrypt showed a convoy sailing, a reconnaissance aircraft had to be sent over that convoy first, visibly, so the Germans would have a mundane explanation for what happened next. If there was no plausible cover story, sometimes nothing was done. Men who knew things sat in rooms and let events run, because the alternative was to protect 100 men today and lose the source that would save 100,000 next year. Nobody who did that job came out of it clean. Nobody who did it talked about it either. And then it was over. May 1945, the war in Europe ends. The fish links go silent one by one as the transmitting stations are overrun and the last teleprinter warble fades off the dial. And in the huts at Bletchley Park, a workforce that had grown to nearly 9,000 by the start of that year finds itself with nothing left to intercept. What happened next is the part of this story that is hardest to tell, and it is the reason we are telling it now, 80 years late. The order came down that the work had never happened. Every person at Bletchley Park had signed the official Secrets Act, not as a formality, as a binding legal instrument with prison at the end of it. And in 1945, they were reminded of it individually and told that the obligation did not expire with the war. They were to go home and say nothing, not to journalists, not to historians, not to their employers, when asked what they had done during the war and why there was a gap in their record. Not to their wives, not to their husbands, not to their children, ever. Then the machines were destroyed, not stored, not mothballed. Broken up. On instruction, most of the Colossi were dismantled, and the parts reduced to pieces small enough that nothing could be reconstructed from them. Racks that had cost thousands of hours of skilled labor were taken apart with hand tools by the people who had built them. Tommy Flowers was ordered to destroy the drawings. Every blueprint, every circuit diagram, every note from Dollis Hill, the complete engineering record of the first machine of its kind ever built. He burned them himself. He would say later, in the flat way that men of that generation said such things, that it had been a mistake, and that he had obeyed. 2 machines survived, moved quietly to the successor organization at Eastcote and later Cheltenham, where they went on doing classified work into the early 1960s before they too were broken up. And that was the end of it. Now consider what that silence actually cost, one man at a time. Tommy Flowers went back to the post office. He had built from nothing, against the express skepticism of the most eminent mathematicians in Britain, the world's first large-scale programmable electronic digital computer. He had proved the reliability principle that made electronic computing possible at all. He had done it on a wartime budget so tight that he had spent his own money to keep it moving. He received an award of around £1,000 after the war. He shared most of it out among the engineers who had worked on the project with him, which tells you everything about the man that a longer account would only dilute. Then he applied to a bank for a loan to build an electronic computer. He was turned down. The bank did not believe such a machine was possible. He could not tell them that he had built one 4 years earlier, and that 10 of them had run day and night in Buckinghamshire. He could not tell them anything. He sat in that office, a man in his early 40s who had already done the thing being described as impossible, and he said nothing, and he went home. Through the late 1940s and the 1950s, the history of computing was written around him. The American ENIAC, unveiled publicly in 1946, took the title and held it for decades. Universities built machines and published papers and gave lectures. Careers were made in the open in a field Flowers had entered first, in the dark. He stayed at the post office. He worked on electronic telephone exchanges. He was a respected engineer with an unexplainable hole in the middle of his life. Bill Tutte went to Canada. He had done, at 24, a piece of reasoning that historians would eventually rank among the supreme intellectual achievements of the war, the reconstruction of a machine he had never seen. From 4,000 characters of static, by writing them out on squared paper until a wheel with 41 positions revealed itself. He could not put it on a resume. He returned to Cambridge, completed a doctorate in mathematics, and in 1948 he took a post in Toronto, and later moved to the University of Waterloo in Ontario, where he spent the rest of his career. He became one of the founding figures of modern graph theory. He built a genuine and distinguished reputation entirely on his open work, and he never once traded on the other thing, because he could not, and because it was not in him to have done so even if he could. He married Dorothea, who worked as a potter, and they lived quietly, and they hiked, and he did mathematics. John Tiltman never stopped. Promoted to brigadier, he moved to Washington after the war and worked alongside American cryptologists, for years one of the very few men honored in both traditions. He died in 1982 in Hawaii at 88, having spent 60 years inside a world he could describe to almost nobody. Alan Turing did not live to see any of it acknowledged. In 1952, he was prosecuted for homosexual acts, then a crime, in Britain, stripped of his security clearance, subjected to hormone treatment as an alternative to prison. He died in 1954 at the age of 41. The country he had helped save had, on paper, no record that he had saved it. Max Newman went to the University of Manchester and took what he had learned in the Newmanry with him and drove the work that produced the Manchester Baby in 1948, the first stored program computer to run. He could not say where the ideas came from. He simply carried them, and the Lorenz, the 272 of them, went home. They were 19, 20, 22 years old. They had stood shifts in a hot hut in the middle of the night operating the most advanced device on Earth, and they had been told nothing, and now they were told to forget it. They married, they raised children, Some of them, decades later, mentioned to their families that they had done something in the war at a place in Buckinghamshire. Typing, clerical work, nothing important. Some of them died still saying that. There is a particular photograph in the mind that will not go away. A woman in her 70s, sitting in a kitchen somewhere in England in 1975, reading in the newspaper for the first time that the thing she did as a girl of 20 was finally allowed to be spoken about. The wall began to crack in 1974, when a former RAF officer published a book that revealed, for the first time, that Britain had been reading Enigma. That opened the ultra-secret in general terms, and the shape of Bletchley Park emerged into public view. But fish stayed classified. The Lorenz Cipher, the Tunny break, Colossus, these were held back long after Enigma became a matter of public knowledge. Because the method still had value, and because British and American signals intelligence had no interest in explaining what could be done with statistics and electronics to countries that were still using rotor machines. Photographs of Colossus were released in the 1970s. The full account came later, in stages, through the 1980s and 1990s. The complete technical history, the general report on Tunny, written in 1945 by Jack Good, Donald Michie, and Jeffrey Timms, which lays out the whole story in detail, was not released to the public until the year 2000. 55 years. Tommy Flowers lived to see some of it. He was appointed MBE in 1943, an honor that could not be explained at the time, and in his later years, as the story emerged, he was finally given the recognition of the computing world. He received honorary doctorates. He was interviewed. Young engineers came to see him. He died on the 28th of October, 1998, at the age of 92. Bill Tutte was made a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and honored for his mathematics, and only in his final years for the other thing. There is a memorial to him now in Newmarket, the town where a gardener's son grew up, and a building named for him at the University of Waterloo. He died on the 2nd of May, 2002, aged 84. The full public appreciation of what he had done arrived essentially at the end of his life, and largely after it. And in a workshop at Bletchley Park over 14 years, a British engineer named Tony Sale led a team that rebuilt Colossus. They had almost nothing to work from. The drawings had been burned. What survived was a handful of wartime photographs, some circuit fragments, and the memories of the men who had built it, including Flowers himself, who lived long enough to see the reconstruction underway and to visit it. The rebuilt machine was working by 1996, and it stands today at the National Museum of Computing on the Bletchley Park site. You can go and stand in front of it. You can watch the tape blur past the reader at 30 miles an hour and hear the counters run and feel the heat coming off the valves. It is the only place on Earth where you can hear what that machine sounded like when it was working. So what is this story in the end? It is not a story about genius, although there was genius in it. It is not a story about heroism in the way the word usually gets used, because nobody in it fired a shot. It is a story about the gap between what a system is on paper and what it becomes in the hands of tired human beings. The Lorenz SZ40 was, as an engineering artifact, superb. The mathematics was sound. The key space was astronomical. 12 wheels, 501 pins, an irregular stutter at the heart of the design specifically intended to defeat statistical attack. German cryptographic authorities examined it and concluded it was secure. And given what they knew, that conclusion was defensible. They did not lose it to a better machine. Britain never had a better machine. Britain never had any machine at all, never saw one, never touched one, never photographed one, right through to the end of the war. They lost it because on a hot afternoon in Athens, a man who had already typed 4,000 characters was told to type them all again. And he took the shortest available road, and then tired. Wanting to be finished, he shortened a word. Spruchner instead of Spruchnummer. That is the whole hinge. Not sabotage, not treason, not incompetence even. Just fatigue at the end of a long shift in a hot room doing a job nobody would ever thank him for. He went home that evening believing he had done nothing at all. And 50 miles northwest of London, a lieutenant colonel who had never been to university spent 10 days with a pencil and read what that man had sent. And a 24-year-old gardener's son spent weeks writing 4,000 characters out in different shapes until a number surfaced. And a bricklayer's son who had been told his machine was impossible built it anyway, with his own money in it, and it worked. 3 men who, in the ordinary running of British society in 1941, would have been nobody's first choice for anything. The official historian, F.H. Hinsley, who had worked at Bletchley Park himself and who wrote the authorized history with access to the files, made the assessment that has stood ever since. The intelligence produced there shortened the war by not less than 2 years, and possibly by as much as 4. 2 to 4 years of a war that was killing people at a rate the modern mind cannot hold. Whatever fraction of that belongs to fish, to Tunny, to the strategic traffic that Enigma could never have carried, the number of human beings who lived because of what happened in those huts is not a number anyone can calculate. None of them knew. Not the soldiers who came home, not the families who got them back, not the men who fired the guns or flew the aircraft or waited up the beaches. And not, for 30 years and more, the people who did it. They went to work, they came home, they said nothing. They watched other men take the credit for the machine and let them have it, because the alternative was prison, and because they had given their word. That is a kind of discipline that has become almost incomprehensible now. If you want a monument to it, it is not the reconstructed Colossus, magnificent as that is. It is the 30 years of silence.